Okay, so hello everyone. I'm Scott Jaschik, editor of Inside Higher Ed, and I'm honored to be your first on your first webinar, and really appreciate the interest in working with the media. I don't know everyone who's on this, but my guess is that a number of you have been great sources to me and to my colleagues over the years. I have learned a lot about adjuncts from members of the new faculty majority. So it's my pleasure to be here today and talk about these issues. This slide shows you my bio, which I won't read. You can look at it later if you're interested. But I wanted to just say a few things by way of introduction. One is that the topic of this presentation on working with the media, working with reporters, is one that I get all the time. And usually I get it from college administrators. I've also had it from various faculty unions, various disciplinary associations. And I think it's great that the people who are contingent faculty are also thinking about these issues, because all these other groups think about them. And I guess I did want you to know that you're not the only ones who are sometimes confused, sometimes critical, in fact, of the way the media covers higher education and your issues. We're going to have lots of time for questions at the end. One thing I did want to say about questions or any comments you want to make is that I am viewing this as a informational program for NFM and your members, not as a means for me to go and write up a story and put it on the web tonight. So please speak freely and don't worry that I'm going to publish immediately whatever you say. So I want to switch to the first slide, and I seem to have again lost control of it. Maria, can you advance?
Let's see. Do you want to try again? See if.
Sure. And it's not working.
No? There.
Okay, now, okay, I think if you just did it, then that's fine. I'll just tell you when to advance the slides.
Okay.
So first, I think it's important to talk about the overall trends in terms of media coverage of higher education, because if you're hoping to get coverage of adjunct issues, you are acting in an environment where it's very hard to get attention for anything in higher education. And much of what I'm talking about here isn't places like Inside Higher Ed or the Chronicle that focus exclusively on higher ed, but your daily newspapers. Main thing to know is that many newspapers and also many local television news operations are in a period of retrenchment right now. There are far fewer reporters. It's much less likely than it used to be for somebody to have beat expertise, meaning they really know what they're covering about higher education. In many cases, education reporting is combined higher ed and K-12, and you have somebody who's chasing, running from school board meeting to school board meeting, not really having a lot of time necessarily to learn the beat. In fact, one of the things that you may find interesting is that many newspapers, many metro dailies, are using a system very similar to the way colleges use adjuncts, in that they are creating bureaus in which the people lack the full salary and benefits of people who work in the headquarters of the newspaper. So you're dealing with an environment where people don't have a lot of time or expertise, and they don't necessarily know a lot about your issues. Very important to remember that most publications, and here again I'm not talking about those that just do higher ed, but most higher education coverage in daily newspapers has very much a consumer orientation. Now, what do I mean by that? I mean that if you imagine, say, the issue of health care, they're less likely to write about whether health care is, good or just, whether the system works or not, than how does this affect you? And I think they do the same thing with higher education. They write a lot of stories about issues like tuition, which they assume their readers will be either students or more likely parents. Will your kid get into college? Will your kid get a job? It's very much focused on traditional age students and from the perspective of the tuition-paying person. Further, most daily newspapers focus on the elites, rest of higher education. This means in the Northeast, they write a lot about private higher education. And much of the rest of the country, you'll see a lot of coverage of, say, the flagship state university in that state, but relatively less on community colleges, on urban publics, on institutions where many of you, in fact, teach and work. This is all important to remember in terms of how you pitch stories. I think that issues affecting the treatment of contingent faculty members very much do relate to the student experience in ways that are very important. And in fact, many contingent faculty are great teachers, are key to the student experience, and the ways that you are held back affect students. This was evident in the recent survey that you all did about how little time most adjunct faculty members get before the start of class to actually prepare for class and to get their classes. But it's that consumer orientation that frequently is going to help you make the hook of a story. More likely, I'm sorry to say, than a story just on an injustice done to an adjunct, although I know that there are many such injustices. Other big change in recently is the rise of the web and social media. And now obviously there is a lot of communication that's going on where an individual adjunct, a group like NFM, or colleges and universities are just going to the web and sharing the stories that they see in terms of what they see going on in higher ed. So the main thing I want you to take away here is that you've got a tough job because there are fewer reporters and they're more stressed and they have less time. Maria, could you advance the next slide, please? Okay, so what do I see? So I start my day every day by looking at what is being covered on everything in higher education, not just on issues affecting contingent faculty members. I have a bunch of customized Google searches set up and various wire services. So I'm casting a wide net, and I was thinking about in preparation for this, what do I see now about adjunct, about contingent faculty members? Obviously, there's a fair amount in Inside Higher Ed, also in the Chronicle, and publications that focus on higher ed. In daily newspapers, though, and in broadcast on the web, I see relatively little. There are certain categories of stories that I will see sometimes. If there is labor strife or protest, I will see coverage of that. I have seen some stories that will turn up when people will try to interest the local reporter in the plight of the freeway flyer, for instance, has been done a number of times. By and large, though, I have to say that I see relatively little coverage that focuses on adjuncts, even though a lot of the stories that are written about higher education very much affect and relate to adjuncts. Next slide, please. So I want to acknowledge that you all have some real disadvantages in seeking press coverage. And here I'm going to talk about how you compare to other groups in higher ed that want press coverage. And lots of groups, I should say, are constantly pitching stories. I get literally hundreds of pitches a day. You obviously, because of the situation that many of you are in, you are running from campus to campus or teaching very large numbers of sections. You don't necessarily have a lot of time and money to spend on it, which is totally understandable. Your organizations don't have staff people or outside PR firms that others do. When I have visits from any college president, they will come with many times with an internal PR person, an external PR person. There's a whole infrastructure about this. They're not setting up the appointments themselves, and you all have to do this on your own, largely on your own or through groups like NFM. The lack of knowledge on the part of many reporters. And here I was thinking about a category of story I see that probably is very frustrating to many of you, which is I'll see a story that will say, you know, there was a such and such a university, they are increasing salaries for faculty members by 2% or whatever. Many times what they mean is they're increasing the salary for full-time or for tenure-track professors by 2%. Many reporters, in my opinion, don't even know to ask, oh, but what about those who teach off the tenure track? So it's important to know many times when you are ignored or when your issues are ignored, it is as likely because they just don't know it as because it's a hostile act or because they don't care. Likewise, many reporters are pushed by their institutions to write about the institutions that are elite and that don't make as much use of adjuncts as other institutions. So these are all real disadvantages that you face in terms of your efforts to get press coverage. But I would argue that there are things you can do that can get attention. Next slide, please. So first you want to sort of do what people would call sort of an audit of the coverage in your area. And you could do this about a local community where you happen to be working, or about your state. And I would encourage you to pay a lot of attention to states in addition to national coverage, because a majority of you likely work at public institutions, and so many issues affecting the financing of higher education are decided at the state level. And so I would start by just saying, is there any coverage of adjunct issues? And just sort of think about, what are they covering, what are they missing? And then I would look at, what types of articles does your local paper like to write? And I would pay attention to things like, do they mostly do issue stories, meaning stories that are, what are freshmen thinking these days? Or do they do mostly stories that are much more tied to a news event, like the freshmen moved in, or there was a protest on campus? Do they like conflict stories versus happy stories? Do they like news pegs? A lot of journalists, a lot of publications really push to have a news peg for everything, which means something happened yesterday and this is what we're going to do. Some publications focus everything on a person. They want a profile. And if you can sort of look for the patterns in these publications, that will help you to propose stories that fit the model of whatever this publication is. Remember, think about the audience, think about who they're trying to serve, in that, say, the audience for Inside Higher Ed is going to be very different than the Chicago Tribune, which is going to be very different from the Chicago Sun-Times. So you want to think about, who are they trying to serve, and that's how you'll do a better job with your pitch. Next slide, please. So it's very important to build relationships with reporters. This takes a little time, and so again, I realize you don't have a lot of time, but what you need, if you want to be called when something is going on, you need to have them already have you be front of mind. So the first thing I would do is identify reporters who are covering higher education for your local press, and also for the state press. And you might also apply this. There aren't a lot of newspapers that still have reporters whose beat is labor, but to the extent that they are, I would include them. I would include state government, the economy, depending on the issues you're focused on. But say you're talking about the higher education reporter. Figure out who it is, and you need to set up a meeting. And I can't stress enough here, take them out for coffee. I know you don't have a lot of money, but take them out for coffee and get to know that person. Ask what they're interested in writing about and what their editors are interested in writing about. Many a reporter will have sort of a list of topics that their editors have said, we want more stories on X. And if you can think about those, you can then propose ideas that fit in with the topics that they are getting encouraged to do more stories on. Provide contact information, including your cell number, where you can be reached on the weekends. Make sure you're checking your email. Consider bloggers and not just people whose job is reporters. In many communities, there are very influential bloggers. I know many, I think we might have some influential bloggers on this call. And I think they are also key sources of news. So cast a wide net, get to know people, ask them what they are interested in. I would also here very much include the student press, if there's an active student press at the universities that you write on. I have been amazed sometimes that at campuses where students are very engaged in the issue of labor, of those who say make the sweatshirts with the university insignia, that there seems to be very little coverage of the labor conditions facing the adjuncts who teach there. So I'd reach out as well to the student journalists and find out what they're interested in doing more on. Next slide, please. So I want this slide is called the cheat sheet, and it's something that I recommend that you do so that those who are writing about your issues have the background knowledge they need to do it well. And I would argue that you can do all of this in a single page, and you can have it ready, you can give it to a higher ed reporter, but also anytime you're dealing with a reporter, maybe a new reporter on the beat or a reporter who doesn't normally write about higher education or adjunct issues but has been drafted to cover a particular issue, you can provide this information. And I think it will really help them because these are facts that you may know but most reporters don't. So starting with at the colleges in your readership area, and most of you are going to live in places with multiple colleges, what share of the faculty members are adjuncts? You know by virtue of the name of new faculty majority how big you are, but most reporters don't. And you need to say, you know, in the readership area of this county where such and such a newspaper operates, did you know that 54% of courses are taught by adjuncts here, 65% at a local community college, whatever? Give them the numbers, which I think will have a powerful impact because I still think a lot of people don't realize that you are the majority. And journalists naturally should care about the group that, that makes up the majority of those doing a lot of teaching. Also draw attention if there are particular fields where adjuncts are disproportionately represented. Nobody should be writing stories about, say, composition without talking to an adjunct because you do a disproportionate share of composition instruction. Nobody should be writing a story about remedial math without without your without the expertise of people who are in your members. So I would really, again, encourage you to let them know where you are most represented. Then this is a tricky question. Who speaks for adjuncts? Some of you will be approaching a reporter just as an individual. I am an adjunct at such and such a college. And don't hold back. Your views should matter. But you need to help the reporter understand, are you speaking as a member of an FM? Are you speaking as a organization that represents adjuncts? Are you a member of a union? Because some adjuncts are unionized. Are you the head of the contingent committee of your campus, of your faculty senate? Journalists really do care about titles and want to know if you're speaking for yourself or a larger group. Likewise, many journalists will routinely go to certain people, say the head of the faculty senate or the head of a faculty union if you're in a campus with collective bargaining, and will assume that that person speaks for all faculty, including contingent faculty. So here's a question, and this is a delicate question. Does the chair of the faculty senate speak for you? Does the union that represents full-time or tenure-track faculty members also represent you? And depending on the answers to that, you need to let reporters know, well, actually, if you want the adjunct perspective, here's who to call. Or you might be on a campus where the head of that all-faculty group does represent you, and you can let them know that. How do salary levels, benefits compare to others? Again, to most reporters, it will be news how poorly many of you are paid. Put down things like the average pay per course, things that will dramatize this so that people know where you're coming from. And then finally identify what the hot issues are for contingent faculty members on your campus. Maria, could I have the next slide, please? So how to pitch. To pitch is to, try to interest somebody in a story. And so here is my advice, and this is based on talking to a lot of reporters who work at other publications, so I haven't tried to tailor this specifically to Inside Higher Ed at all. One is keep it short. Most journalists get lots and lots of pitches a day, and so a very long pitch is less likely to be picked up than a quick to-the-point pitch. In a few sentences, you should be able to say, you should be able to say, here's what the idea is, here's why it matters, here's who to call. If you make the hook, if the journalist is interested, there will be lots of time for you to provide more information. Find out from the journalist you're pitching, do they prefer email or a call? I prefer email because it always works and I'm always online. Some people aren't email people. but find out what they want. And remember, it can be 3 sentences. You don't need to have a press release. Now, one exception to this is if you are pitching a story to radio or television, they are always going to want to know instantly, what can we broadcast, what can we film? So there, if you're pitching it, I would always include a line saying you could tape so-and-so, you could take video of so-and-so. That's going to be an immediate question for them. Now, reporters will be then, in their minds, going through a lot of questions. And the first, and I've put down here a bunch of the questions that they will ask. And the first question, which I cannot stress enough, is going to be, is this new? They're going to say, how is this different from the last story? And so think about that. They're going to say, is this significant? Why does this matter? And why does this matter to more than the people involved? Does this affect many people or just one? Does this affect students? Will my readers who aren't in higher education find this interesting? Metro dailies will be very much asking, do people who don't work in higher education care? And it's very important that you think about these questions and have answers to them ready, because one of the things that's important is journalists will pay more attention to those who have pitched stories that they have found in the past to be accurate and thoughtful. But these are a lot of the questions they'll ask. Now, then you want to have documentation ready, have contact info ready. Don't send it all when you're getting the first, just trying to interest somebody. But these are things that you want to be able to prove if you get somebody interested. Finally, be precise. So to give you an example, and this comes up with many adjunct issues, is there's a difference, for instance, between being fired and not being renewed. Those are things that both matter hugely, both can be terribly unfair, but they're actually different things. And I think it's very important with journalists. We care a lot about precision of language. So be sure that you can back up exactly what you say. Next slide, please. Wanted to give some examples of why we wrote recently about some issues, because I think they'll show why we got interested, and in most of these cases other people got interested as well, many times after we did the story first. And so one is the controversy over job ads requiring recent PhDs. And this, for those of you who didn't follow, several universities were advertising for openings in which they said that a requirement was to have a PhD earned after 2010 or after 2009. And we learned about this actually through social media and through people emailing me and saying, hey, you should check this out. So the reason we thought it was interesting, I mean, to me, this is blatant discrimination against many of you. Many of you may have earned PhDs years ago, and because of the job market, you maybe were unable to find a tenure-track position, and now you're in effect being punished by being told you can't apply if you didn't get your PhD last year. We've quoted different people on whether this constitutes age discrimination, but regardless of the legal issue, to me, this was a sort of an injustice story. Why are people doing these? Why are programs doing this? Is it legal? And I could tell from the Twitter traffic, and then as soon as we posted the stories from the traffic on our site, people really cared. And it was immediately clear that they cared. The other interesting thing to me about this story is it was sort of out in the open what many people have assumed has been the case before. Many have assumed that a lot of departments claim to be open to everyone but favor recent PhDs. These departments actually admitted it in public. Then there's the very interesting case, the Sissy Bradford case at Texas A&M San Antonio. She is a contingent faculty member who raised some church-state issues, then told a local newspaper about the threats she received, and then after she told the local newspaper about that, all of a sudden her courses disappeared for the next semester. And what she did when she taught to me, she had great documentation. She had the emails that offered her those courses. She had the emails from the bookstore showing that she was assigned those courses. She also had, and this is very important, this comes up a lot when people say that they lost their courses, the college or university will say, oh, well, we didn't have that need anymore. She had job ads being placed by the university to teach the courses she was teaching. And this goes to my earlier point about documentation. It's very easy for things to turn into a he said, she said. She had all the evidence. And that, frankly, makes a possible story go much higher on my list and on other reporters' lists. The Jill Biden salary story is an example of a story that just comes up quickly, whereas there's routine stories whenever every year the president and vice president file their tax returns. And this year, Jill Biden's return noted, and they also include their spouses, that she had been paid $82,000. And so this prompted discussion on the Agile listserv and from emails that we received here saying, how is it possible that she, as an adjunct, got that kind of money? It turned out, although she has described herself as an adjunct previously, that she's now an associate professor. So while her adjunct salary was, I think, about $42,000 and also fairly high for an adjunct, she's no longer an adjunct. But this was sort of in the news, timely because of the tax returns, but it also created a potential opportunity to remind people that adjuncts don't, by and large, earn $82,000. For-profit stories. We written in the last year about Argosy doing budget cuts that involved salary cuts for adjuncts teaching there. We've also written about Grand Canyon University creating full-time positions for some of its adjuncts. And I throw these out because I think an undercovered area of adjunct life is adjuncts who work in the for-profit sector. I think it's very difficult for adjuncts in the for-profit sector because they may feel that they don't have the traditional faculty governance to protect them. But we're very interested in that group of people, so very much want stories about them. We've also written about crowdsourcing salary data, which maybe some of you were involved in those efforts. We were interested in that because, again, it was sort of adjuncts taking charge and trying to say, we want to draw attention to how little money we make. Now, what are some examples of stories we don't typically do? One is we are somewhat leery, and this isn't unique to adjuncts, is general statements that people make of support. So when a group says, we care deeply about adjuncts, but there's no substance to it, we don't pay it that much attention because, frankly, I think they're not doing that much. Likewise, if we've already reported on a conflict, we tend not to do a blow-by-blow on that as things develop, although a local paper might do more. But again, I think many times we're going to do one major story on a conflict, not do a whole bunch. Maria, could I have the next slide, please? Thank you. I'm briefly on a few words of vocabulary so that you can use them with more confidence with journalists. One is off the record or on background. There are various variations of this. I would advise you not to use them. And the reason I would advise you not to use them is that they mean different things to different journalists. So if you're talking and you want to be quoted not for attribution, and I can understand why many adjuncts who don't have job security would want to do this, say what you mean. Say, you can call me an adjunct at such and such state university, but not use my name. If it's relevant, you might want to say, according to a humanities faculty member or whatever. But rather than using the lingo, which increases the odds that you and the journalist may not have the same thing in mind, say exactly what you mean, and it's very important that you say it before the interview. Most journalists will not let you retroactively make an interview off the record. So you need to do this beforehand. An embargo is when you provide information in advance. This happens many times with the reports. And so people will say, this information can be used after 12:01 a.m. on September 25th or whatever. And that's a way to get information out there, do interviews, meet with the reporters or talk to the reporters on the phone, but not have the story appear instantly. A Sunday story is a term you may hear from many Many daily newspapers, they tend to be longer, more investigative, and so forth. And beat would be the areas that a journalist is responsible for covering. Almost done here, so almost ready for questions. Maria, if you can have the next slide, please. So, journalists are not perfect. I know I have just shocked you there with that statement, but journalists do make mistakes, and it's important that you point them out if you think a journalist has made a mistake. One thing, though, that to start with is there's a difference between an error and omission. An error is a fact that is just not true, whereas an omission might be something that you wish the reporter had included but didn't. Errors you should always try to get corrected. And it's important that you try to get them corrected because databases that have all the past stories will be used the next time a journalist is assigned to write about this topic. So if you don't correct it, then the next time somebody else is going to remake the same error. The way to get a correction is to start with the reporter. If the reporter doesn't help, move to the editor. Be very succinct, low-key. Don't Try not to be angry, even if you're angry. And most journalists who are responsible will fix the correction, will note the correction. But we tend to be suspicious when somebody calls screaming and yelling that he or she doth protest too much. So ask for it politely, explain the issue, and that will work. Now, if you feel somebody's written a story, but they've left out key perspectives, the adjunct perspective, for instance, that's more of a case where you would post a comment on a story or write a letter to the editor. I think there you're saying, in your story on faculty salaries at such and such university, you neglected to mention that those raises don't go to adjuncts. And this is what you should know. They're not well paid, or whatever your points are. Generally, you have a much better chance with letters to the editor if they're short and to the point. I would also very much encourage you to post on comment boards, on our site, on other publications' websites, because you can instantly get your view out. And now going to the final slide, I wanted to throw it open to your questions and reactions, as well as to get your ideas about story ideas that Inside Higher Ed should write about. And I'm happy to help you brainstorm if you have ideas that maybe aren't right for us, but might be more for your local publications, about how to pitch them. I wanted to close by saying that I've offered a lot of advice. I don't want in any way to minimize that you have long odds against you because you don't have the time, money, the PR staff, and so forth. But the reason I would encourage you to try to get more attention, and why I hope you'll continue to pitch stories to me, as so many of you have, is that I think your issues are hugely important. You are the majority of teachers. Your issues matter. They matter to you and to your students. And so that's why I'm so excited to hopefully help you get more of your stories told. So thank you to NFM for this opportunity, and I welcome your questions.
Thank you so much, Scott. That's really terrific. And by way of starting, what I'm going to do first, and bear with me, I'm going to launch a poll. We put together a poll just to get some information about whether or not you've ever contacted the media, print, online, or broadcast, about contingent faculty issues. So if you wouldn't mind answering that for us, that would be great. In the meantime, we have one question. It says, I haven't read today's IHE yet, but are you covering the Phil Jack embezzlement case in Washington and the possible retaliation against those who reported it?
We have not yet written about that case. I have gotten some emails about it. That would be a case where the my hesitancy is that we have written previously several articles about the conflicts there between adjunct leaders and the leaders of the union. And so, so there's probably a higher bar for us to go back to that for that very reason, that we have written about the fact that many adjunct leaders and that union don't see eye to eye on many issues.
Okay. Let's see. Okay. Next question is, does an embezzlement raise the bar in that case?
It might.
Okay. And I'm also happy to unmute people if people would like to make comments. So let me know on the question panel if you would like me to unmute you so that you can make a comment. You can also raise your hand. There's a raise hand function that you can also use. And so far we have 76% people have voted, and right now 44% are saying that no, they have not contacted media because they didn't know how to do it. So this means this is hopefully helping out.
Good.
Okay, here's another question. Do you think press releases are bad or just not worth the effort?
I think they can be helpful if you're releasing a report and it has, a lot of data that you need to explain. Or if you're inviting people, like, when the NFM has a meeting or is issuing a statement, some new policy. But to alert people to a general issue, like, we might go on strike, or we're very concerned that adjuncts lost a certain right that they had, I don't think they're generally necessary. So the more, unless it's like an event or a report, I would encourage you to go with short emails, and that also encourages you to then customize the email. So you might pitch me a story in a different way than you would pitch a story to a local newspaper reporter. If you like press releases and there's somebody in your group who likes to write them, that's fine. But again, I would encourage you to make them very short.
Okay. Here's another question. Would like to hear the rest of the poll results. Let me share the poll results with you all. Let's see if this works. Okay, so it ended up being 37% did not contact the press because you didn't know how to do it. 26 no, because I was afraid of possible retaliation, and also yes, but it did not turn out the way that I had hoped. And only, yeah.
Yeah, I wanted to talk a little bit about the fear of possible retaliation.
Yeah, please.
Because I know that is a very real fear for many of you who have no job security, and you're worried that you might be, being quoted would lead to you not getting any more teaching assignments. Publications vary on whether they're willing to grant people anonymity, and so if you are worried and you know that you want to be assured on that first, it's totally legit to call a reporter, and I get these calls sometimes, and they'll say, can we talk without you using my name at all in any way, even before the reporters decided to do a story. And I think most people will say yes. Now, when writing the story, there are publications that don't quote anonymous people, so there may be difficulty in writing about it without you. But you should ask first, can we have this discussion without me being quoted, and then explain why. Like, our policy here is we prefer to quote people with a name than rather without a name. But if we have a reason, if there's a good reason, we'll quote somebody without their name. And frankly, fear of not being rehired or fear of retaliation is a good reason. And it's particularly a good reason because you are an adjunct. To me, it has less credibility if it was a tenured faculty member saying the same thing. So don't let that hold you back. I don't mean to suggest that your fear is unjustified, but you can ask, and if you get an assurance from a good journalist, they will honor that. Certainly we do, and we have done many stories about adjunct issues that, in fact, have been prompted by people who started off by saying, can I tell you about this, and not be quoted on it.
Okay. Another question. Thanks, Scott. Any thoughts on pitching stories from the student perspective? Can stories like these go beyond a campus newspaper?
Yes. I mean, I'm not quite sure where the question is going, but I'm going to try. So one is issues that affect students. And so here I'm thinking about things like, what is the impact on your students about the fact that some of you don't have offices? Mm-hmm. What is the impact on your students if you don't know if you're going to be teaching a course next semester or not. Many students, value the relationships they form with faculty members who they can take an intro course with and a more advanced course with. That is very much an issue that affects students. Another issue we've done some on, and I've seen some in local publications, but I think there could be more, is what is the impact on students when course size increases? And so many people have told me, and this is adjunct and tenure for that matter, that in a writing course, for instance, if you go from 20 students to 30 students, each student is getting less attention. And so that can be pitched to a local reporter in a way of saying the working conditions of faculty members, in this case contingent faculty members, are having an impact on how much guidance they can give to your students. You are going to be generally less successful, I'm sorry to say, with most places by putting the emphasis on how poorly you're paid. Because we cover higher ed as an industry, we care about that. And so I'm very proud of stories we've done on things like the fact that in some states people are working 6, 7 course loads and not getting health insurance. That's going to be a tougher sell for most local papers. So I think a student perspective is a good one.
Okay, great. Another question, can you talk more about who the consumer is that the press understands itself to be serving? Your point about what is new being considered, I'm sorry, go ahead, that was all one question.
Sure,
so
sure.
The idea of the consumer.
And this is a tricky idea because I actually fear that the consumer here is an elite consumer. And so it may be, and it may frankly be doing a disservice to the readership of a given publication. But many times it's what would the publisher want to know? What would those in our wealthier suburb want to know? And that drives the emphasis on colleges tend to favor the institutions where those people would want to send or do send their children. So it's a very practical orientation, and I fear an elite one. But what I think, even when it's not elite, the assumption is that the consumer is the parent, which you'll notice this leaves out non-traditional students who are making their decisions on college on their own and paying for it themselves. But many times it's the assumption that it's the parent, and that the parent wants to know, will my kid get in? How much will it cost me? Will my kid graduate in 4 years? Will my kid get a job or go into graduate school? It's a very practical, student-focused consumer orientation. It explains why rankings are so phenomenally popular. People really care about things like that. Now, I happen to believe that the way faculty members are treated has a huge impact on the student experience, but again, that's the sort of consumer orientation that they're thinking about.
Right, and a question that's also come in, which is this makes a similar point. Your point about what is new being considered a good story is a criteria for most of the mainstream commercial press, but is very prejudicial against those not in power in general, as we are not in higher education or in most unions or disciplinary organizations. The most important stories are not new, but rather the continuation of long-term trends. So how can we get beyond the if it bleeds, it leads tendency with all of the commercial press?
Well, you can. I think it is hard, but what you need to do is find new ways to draw attention to key issues. So my guess is for many of you, the key issue is, key issues would include lack of fair salary, lack of health insurance or adequate health insurance, lack of job security. And so the problem is is that new standard? You're right, that would not meet that standard because it's been that way for a long time. But so what you do, I have written stories where, I wrote a story once where my lead was, there's a new form of adjunct abuse out there, in which I'm sort of acknowledging that this was a new variation on that theme of not paying people enough. You can use pegs such as when other employees at the institution or in your community are getting new benefits, well, are you getting, who is left out? So the peg might not be, you might not have changed, but the peg might have been somebody else has changed. This recent controversy that we've been writing about over discrimination against recent PhDs. I actually think there are ramifications of that for a whole bunch of other fields. I think there is a bias in hiring against people who aren't perceived as, quote, fresh, whether it's the entry-level employee fresh out of college or the academic fresh out of grad school. And you might pitch a story to a lifestyle or labor reporter on this sort of discrimination against people who didn't, discrimination against people who, by no fault of their own, entered a terrible job market and couldn't immediately land the perfect long-term position. That affects a ton of people who aren't in academia, and you can make that trend one that you could build a story pitch around.
Okay. I noticed that Joe Barry has had his hand up, so I'm going to unmute you, Joe. Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah, you might want to turn your sound down on your computer, and because I saw that you might want to make a comment.
Turn my sound down?
On your computer, yeah, that way you won't hear the echo.
Okay.
There you
Can you hear
go.
me now?
Yep.
Yes, I can. Hi, Joe.
Yeah, hi. Thanks for doing this. What do you think about the issue of your, I know this we were talking about in general, the press in general, but if you would be willing to entertain a question about your own publication and the higher ed trade press in particular, because we have to focus so much on that, of course,
Sure.
is that you mentioned who sort of becomes the default elite target audience in the minds of reporters and editors and publishers. For general press, who is sort of the default audience for the trade press, you guys and your brother and sister publications? It is the impression of many of us that the main, not exclusive, but the main audience you see yourselves writing for is administrators.
Well, I don't want to speak for my fellow, for other trade press, but I'll speak for Inside Higher Ed. And our attitude actually is quite different. We want everybody. We want faculty and administrators, and you can tell that, in fact, by our business strategy. As you may know, we are 100% free. No content on our site is restricted to people who can pay. And that's because we believe that you shouldn't have to have an expense account to have good information. And so even though we could actually make money if we just cared about the administrators because they would pay us, we would rather, I believe we do a better job of coverage because we have so many readers who are faculty and administrators, and within the faculty, tenure track, tenured, contingent, grad students, librarians, all sorts of job categories. And so I look, when we do our reader surveys, we do not have actually a majority of any one group, and we have a lot of adjunct readers. And so we have probably more adjuncts reading us than we have vice presidents reading us. Now there are a lot more adjuncts, but actually there are a lot of vice presidents these days too. So we have set up our site from a business model, from areas of coverage, very consciously not to focus on the elite. And that also extends, I mean, I mentioned it by job title, but for instance, it's very important as we have lots of community college readers and take very seriously what happens at community colleges. Again, you're talking about an audience that isn't the elite in higher ed. We don't just care about the Ivies. We care about the Ivies, but also care about others. So that's something we really strive to do. And if you ever think we're missing the mark, call me or send me an email.
Can I ask a follow-up?
Sure.
Many of us along those lines, and there were, I must say, some somewhat cynical jokes told, were extremely disappointed that you chose not to cover the COCAL conference in Mexico. And in common with your brother and sister publications, all of whom were inundated with notices about it and urgings to do it. And we, I think many of us wondered, given your past coverage of CoCal conferences and CoCal in general, why that was the case.
We have covered CoCal in the past, and my hope is we would do in the future. There was probably a higher bar because it was further away. And actually, I talked to a number of folks who I have seen at past meetings, and I had heard that many of them weren't going. I don't know what the attendance ended up being. But there are very few meetings that we cover 100% every year, every time they take place. But I would hope that we'll be at CoCal in the past. We covered, and we very much want to do outreach to these groups. I actually presented at CoCal in San Diego. I think that's probably 2 CoCals back, although I might have my timing off. So we do care about the group. We want to cover it, but it's just we can't. It is more difficult when it's in Mexico City than when it's here or closer. We were all over the NFM first meeting, and something we did there that I'd like to do again is we had a great sort of focus group dinner we did where we took a bunch of NFM members out to just talk informally about issues. So we hope to piggyback off of other such events to cover. I'm sorry we disappointed you by not being in Mexico City.
Oh, can you hear me?
I can.
Okay. Can everybody hear me? Okay. I think I was muted. We have another question from a tenured professor working on behalf of contingent faculty on my campus as chair of our union's contingent faculty committee. This person says, I worry about the ethics of speaking for these faculty, but I know my protected position may allow me greater range of action. Excuse me. Do you think reporters will question my ability or authority to speak for contingent faculty?
That's a really good question, and we actually have run several op-ed pieces about that. And I think in the op-ed pieces that we've run and in some stories, I think first and foremost what it requires is honesty, and actually your question puts the issue out there. And so I think people need to be honest about this is my perspective and this is the basis for my perspective. And then you might want to think about other questions. So for instance, if you are an officer in a faculty senate or in a union, and that union does in fact represent contingent faculty, or the faculty senate does, then you can say, based on discussions with my colleagues who are off the tenure track, here are some issues that they care about, and this is why I'm coming forward to speak out loud about this because I have tenure. The other thing you can do, I think, also might go directly to the concern that was expressed in this poll about fear of possible retaliation. I think you could play a key role in reaching out to a reporter and having that first discussion where you say, I've got some people who want to come forward to talk about such and such an issue, but they're concerned. Can you tell me how you would treat them in terms of identifying them? And you might be able to get over that hurdle, which is a very real one for some. But I also think, we rely on people who are dubbed, quote, leaders of groups to speak all the time. I'll call Maria to say, we're working on such and such an issue, and, what is the NFM perspective? And, and she knows that her opinion, sometimes she'll say, well, my personal opinion is this. Sometimes she'll say, the group thinks this. Sometimes there are issues that affect adjuncts in different ways, and there may not be a consensus. So I think drawing attention to it, to what you can and can't say, being honest is the best way. But there is a need for more people to be speaking out and to be available to be interviewed. So I applaud your interest.
Okay. I'm going to try and combine a couple of questions that are on a similar topic here. And this has to do with stories that I suppose you think are no longer new or about which there's nothing new to report. for example, already reporting on a conflict, but the conflict is unresolved, or having reported on, say, Joe Biden's comments about faculty salaries, but then nothing happens further. Can you give us some advice about how to pursue those kinds of stories, whether it's in writing letters to the editor or in persuading you to cover some other angle of the story?
Yeah, you might think one is there is the follow-up. Did anything change after an issue was raised? Or to take, this would be a recent example where we wrote about this issue of these job ads that basically openly discriminate against people who earn their PhDs more than 2 years ago. Our first story was like, hey, look, there's this ad, and everyone's talking about it. Then the next story was prompted by people saying, guess what? It's going on at a lot of places. So what's new might be that it's going on at a lot of places. What's new might be somebody has come up with a potential solution. What's new might be, as you suggest, an op-ed saying, this is what it feels like to me. I just accepted for publication a piece we'll probably be running next week by an adjunct who's talking about why she quit and what the final straw was about why she loved teaching, but why she decided she couldn't stick with it. In this case, what's new isn't the issue because the conditions she described are sadly not remotely new, but it was the personal story on it. So when I say people ask what's new, that's not the only thing that they'll consider, but I'm saying you just want to factor that in, and if you can think about what's new or different, you'll have better odds.
Right, so or different perspective on an old issue. Okay.
Absolutely.
Well, that kind of connects to this other question. I'm hoping, I know we have 1 minute left, but Scott, would you mind staying on for just a couple of minutes?
Sure, we can go a few minutes over.
Okay. Is it worth trying to pitch a story that connects concerns about tuition and college debt with the increase in adjunct labor? In other words, beginning to ask, where is that money going if not for instruction? Is there, do you see that there's an interest in that angle right now?
Yes, because tuition speaks directly to that consumer issue.
Yeah.
And so parents, students are very conscious of that. And again, some of the things they're interested in, I mean, my sense is that parents are getting a very good quality of teaching from contingent faculty members. But what they might not get, which they also think they want from that tuition dollar, is, will the person who taught my son or daughter as a freshman be there when she's a senior and needs a letter of recommendation? And will that person have the time to write a letter of recommendation? People assume when they're paying tuition, they're paying for not just the in-course instruction, but a lot more. And to the extent you can show that increases in tuition are or aren't related to the student experience, I think that's I think that will be, many people will be receptive to that.
Great. And then last question, do you think people are more likely to read op-eds and letters and comments than read news stories, especially if the stories aren't page one type stories?
You know, it varies by publication, and I would say you want to pitch both, because there can be a power in an op-ed that really will move people and make them think about issues because of the personal, because of the opinion in it. At the same time, news, there are some people who only read news. So I would encourage you to think of both kinds of coverage and not restrict yourself to one or the other. Likewise, if you happen to be a good op-ed writer, but you're not, you know, super comfortable pitching news stories, go where your strength is, and hopefully a colleague will go in another direction. I guess I wanted to close just by saying that I think my email address is on here, and if it's not, it's Scott, SCOTT.Jaschik, J-A-S as in Sam, C-H-I-K, at InsideHigherEd.com. I welcome your comments. I welcome your ideas. I may not always agree. I may not do every story you want or go to every meeting, but we do care. We want your views. And to me, what's so exciting about this discussion today is this is a discussion I've had for so many administrator groups, for other faculty groups. To me, it's really important to be doing it with such an important part of the higher ed world. So thank you so much for this invitation.
Well, thank you so much, Scott, for agreeing to do this, and again, for agreeing to allow us to make this recording available and the slides available to our members. We really, really appreciate that, and I've asked you to give us any ideas for future webinars, and I encourage everyone who is on also to send us ideas for additional webinars, because we'd love to be able to provide this service going forward. Thank you so much, everyone who participated, for your excellent questions, and you'll be receiving a review, a feedback form in your email boxes, and please feel free to send Scott questions and to send me questions or comments as well. Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you, Scott.
Bye.
Okay, take care.